Hello friends and welcome back to another favorites video. I know it only feels like yesterday that I did a favorites for January, but February is a short month, so let's just dive right in. Let's start with the books. So I actually have a manga, a graphic novel, and a literary fiction pick to tell you about this month. I actually just finished a reading vlog over on my second channel where I read a bunch of first volumes of manga series that I have on my shelf. And the one that I loved the most is Fruits Basket. I adored this. Well, if you watch that vlog, and I will leave a link to it in the description box below, I wasn't obsessed with it immediately, but this story has definitely grown on me. It does have a bit of a weird premise, but if you haven't heard about it before, do bear with me because I promise it's not some weird furry thing. It's actually very sweet. We follow our main character, Toru, who is living with her grandfather because her mother's passed away, but she has to sort of move out for a short period of time while his house gets renovated. And she ends up sort of accidentally living with the Soma family. She does go to school with one of the boys from the Soma family, but he's very mysterious and no one knows much about him. Pretty soon, Toru figures out why. It's because their family is cursed. Basically, if any of them are hugged or if their body is sort of in a great deal of stress, they magically transform into one of the animals of the Chinese zodiac. But that is actually surprisingly not as much a part of the plot and the story as I thought it was going to be. Instead, this is much more about different characters and different characters sort of dealing with the challenges of life. And as this volume progresses, more mysteries and sort of curiosities around the Soma family emerge. And so you're left at the end of this volume realizing that I think this story is going to be a lot more complex and interesting than I first thought. Anyway, because I have had trouble getting hold of some of the subsequent volumes, Blair and I have started watching the anime together. So that is also another favorite of mine from the month of February. The anime is really sweet as well. So I know this manga is not a new thing, but I'm officially on the bandwagon. I really, really love this. Then my favorite graphic novel from this month, and actually probably one of my favorite graphic novels I've ever read, is The Magic Fish by Trung Nguyen. And some of you might recognize that name or maybe even the art style. This is by the creator of the Star Spinner Tarot. Now, at some point I did know that he had done a graphic novel and I had always sort of planned to get it, but I just never got around to figuring out what it was and ordering it. And then at work, I was putting this away on the shelf and just sort of flicking through, I recognized the art style. I was like, this looks so much like the Star Spinner Tarot. And lo and behold, it is. It's Trungle's. So of course I had no choice but to pick this up for myself and read it. I dove right in and I adored it. This is one of the most heartfelt, touching, beautiful stories I've ever read. And to top it off, Trungle's artwork is gorgeous. This is set in the 1990s and it follows a Vietnamese American family. The parents fled Vietnam during the Vietnam War and their son, who I think from memory is about 11 years old. He was born in America, so he primarily speaks English, while his parents primarily speak Vietnamese. They can communicate, each of them speaks the other language a little bit, but they're not particularly fluent. So even though they can communicate, they sometimes struggle to communicate, complex emotions and complex ideas. And so this beautiful family has established a bit of a habit of reading fairy tales to each other. They read fairy tales from different parts of the world, sometimes more Western fairy tales, other times Vietnamese fairy tales. And it's really interesting seeing the correlations and similarities or the differences between these stories. And it's really cool how color is used throughout the graphic novel to illustrate whether what you're reading is part of a fairy tale that the characters are reading, or whether you're in present day, or if you're in the past in Vietnam. And I think that's really cool and it's very effective because the fairy tales are as much a part of the story as the narrative of the characters themselves is. And in current day, the son is starting to realize that he might be gay. And he's struggling to communicate that to his parents. There is homophobia represented in here and it's really hard to read. It's very sad. But ultimately, this is an absolutely beautiful story about family, identity, belonging, and about figuring out who we are and communicating that with the people that we love. I cried my way through this. I think it's so beautifully done. It's such a gorgeous, simple, but effectively told story. And I think if you have the Star Spinner Tarot, you will know just how much Trungle's incorporates fairy tales and folklore and different stories from around the world. And you can definitely see how much fairy tales matter to Trungles because like it's such a big part of this graphic novel as well. So whether you have the Star Spinner Tarot or not, I highly recommend this graphic novel. It is superb. And then my favorite novel of the month has absolutely been Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson. I borrowed this from the library, so I don't have it here to show you, but this book is one that is staying with me. This is a short novella and it's absolutely moving and some of the most beautiful lyrical writing I've read in a long time. It's basically about a young black man and a young black woman in Britain slowly falling in love. They both went to private schools on scholarships, so they sort of have like an awkward sense of belonging in Britain. They're both artists. She's a dancer and he's a photographer. And it's actually told in second person, which is obviously not a narrative device that gets used very often. I certainly haven't read it very often, but it's very effective here because it feels so immediate. It is told from the perspective of the man in the relationship and in the situation. And it's just absolutely one of the most sensitive, heartbreaking, vulnerable narratives I've ever read. It is a romance, and that part of the story is absolutely essential to the character development and just the experience. But the book is also a lot about exploring the impacts of being a black man in a racist society and the violences that he experiences, both big and small, in everyday life, make this really big-hearted, sweet, vulnerable man withdraw in order to survive. It demonstrates so effectively and so immediately how this racism, it's killing him slowly. This was about hate turning inward and resulting in an inability to accept and embrace love. This is my favorite book that I've read so far this year. It was just perfection. It was so real, so emotional, and just gorgeous, gorgeous writing, like just perfection. Okay, now let's dive into my favorite decks of February. The first one is a bit of a carryover from last month. It's This Might Hurt Tarot. I did a whole tarot in practice with this deck, which I will leave a link to in the cards in the description box below for you in case you missed it. So I won't talk too much about it because I feel like I've spoken about it quite a bit on this channel lately, but it's just a fabulous deck and I feel like it's just a good one to have. A lot of you commented in that tarot in practice that I wasn't really talking a lot about the imagery, and I think in part that is just because it is so Rider-Waite-Smith that it just meant that I was focused on the messages rather than looking into the details of the art and the symbolism and seeing what else I could uncover with new interpretations of the cards. Because I know these images so well because of my associations with the Rider-Waite-Smith and my knowledge of that deck, it meant that the messages just sort of flowed in a very easy way. Like I just read the cards without thinking about it too much. And that was a really nice experience to have. I love diving into the symbolism and the alternative messages that come through when we look at, certain artwork and certain depictions of cards. It's one of my favorite things to do. That's why I like having many different decks and different options available to me. But it is also nice to have those decks that just speak clearly. And for me, this is one of those decks. The production on this is great. The Little White Book is fabulous. All around, it's just like a solid, good value kind of deck. Then the deck that I just could not help but pull out after reading the graphic novel pick this month was, of course, the Star Spinner Tarot. This is a deck, again, I've done a full tarot in practice with. If you would like to see that, link in the cards above and the description box below. I love this deck. It's one of my favorites. I just think it's so colorful and fun and pretty, and it is fairly Rider-Waite-Smith based, but there's also enough deviation to keep me interested. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of fairy tales and folklores and different kind of stories incorporated into the art and into the choices that are made in the depictions of the cards. That is not really explored in the Little White Book, and that is something that I would love to have seen, especially as me, someone who is not very familiar with different fairy tales and stories from around the world. It would have been nice even just to have a reference to know where to learn more about those stories. Having said that though, this is just a really great solid reader even if you don't have that knowledge and that context. It does also have 4 options for you to pick for a lover's card, which I think is really cool. And Trungle's very particular stylistic artwork is just something that I really, really like, both in the graphic novel and of course here in all of the 81 cards you get in this beautiful deck. The minors are great. I really love how they're sort of color-coded for each of the suits, but the major arcana I think is really where Trungle's artwork stands out. They're really detailed, really colorful, lots of contrasting colors, It's just gorgeous. And I love that this is mass produced. Like, I think this is a very affordable deck for what you get and the quality that you get, which is something that I, as an Australian, someone who very often has to spend a lot of money just on shipping for beautiful independent decks, that's something that I do really appreciate. And then the deck that I've been spending the most time with this month, and is the next deck that will be up in a tarot in practice very soon, so keep your eye out for that, is the Oriens Tarot by Ambi Sun. This is a deck that you will know if you've been following my channel, I've kind of fallen in love with lately, and rather unexpectedly so. I've spoken at length on this channel about how I don't tend to love animal decks, but this has proven to be the exception. I also don't tend to favor decks that have a very dark color palette, partly just because I sort of feel like I struggle to see the imagery sometimes. I don't know whether that's my own vision or whatever. So this is not a deck that on paper would typically work for me, but for some reason, however this deck has come together, it works. I love how the animals are almost represented as if they're constellations, as if they're cosmic beings. The colors used are absolutely breathtaking, and the guidebook, which I did purchase separately, is also incredible. It's beautiful to look at, but it's also very thorough. Anyway, I won't talk too much about this one because, as I said, a full tarot in practice will be coming soon. This deck is now available mass market through Rockpool. I think they've changed the name to the Oriens Animal Tarot. Fair enough, I guess it's a bit more descriptive. So I'm very happy that this deck is still available, and in fact even more accessible now. And I've very much been enjoying working with it in February. Now for the content that I really enjoyed this month. As with last month, I haven't watched a huge amount of YouTube this month, but one video that I did see that I knew I had to talk about in my favorites video was a book review that Carrie Mallon recently did. Now, you'll all know that I've been a stan of Carrie Mallon for a very long time, but she started pumping out a few more videos lately, which has been very exciting to me. And one that she recently did was a book review on the Tarot Handbook, which is a bit of a tarot classic, I suppose, but the author doesn't have the same name recognition, at least these days, that people like Rachel Pollack and Mary K. Greer do, even though it was published around the same sort of time and era. In fact, I think I remember Carrie mentioning that Mary K. Greer and Angeles Arian were friends, and I really enjoyed this book review because it was, of course, a book review, but Carrie also took the time to sort of contextualize that book in terms of tarot history and that era of tarot books being produced. I especially loved how she spoke about some of the concepts and ideas that we almost throw around without crediting anyone, because they almost feel like just part of the tarot world and part of the tarot narrative these days, actually originated with Angeles Arian and this book. I think it was even things like the card of the year and like the personality cards calculated from your like birth date, for example. These originated with this book and this author. I first came into contact with those things in Mary K. Greer's Tarot for Yourself, and apparently she sort of got these ideas from Angeles Arian and expanded on them and sort of made them her own in so many ways. But it's just interesting to have Carrie talk about this book and, I don't know, the impact that it's had on the language around tarot and how we use tarot. And so many of us don't even know where this stuff comes from. The book itself is based on Crowley's Thoth Tarot, so it might not be a book for all readers. And I'm not even sure that it's a book that I want to pick up, but I really enjoyed Carrie's video and her exploration of what she liked about the book, what she didn't. But primarily I loved how she spoke a little bit about where this book is situated in terms of the language around tarot, the history of tarot, and how tarot has developed, or like modern tarot has developed. So a wonderful video that I will leave a link to below for you. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was Samantha Menzo's Inside Out Tarot Challenge. I did do a video response to this. If you missed that, I will leave a link in the cards and the description box below. I had so much fun with this tag. I mean, it took me ages to go through every single one of my deck and pick out different cards to represent the different characters or emotions from the movie Inside Out. Anyway, I thought it was such a fun and clever take on the TikTok trend and really gave me an opportunity to go through and look at my cards in a little bit of a different way. Like, I do often look at cards through the lens of emotions and emotional experience, but just focusing on the imagery more than the card itself really opened up some opportunities for some interesting insights to come through. I know a couple of you have done responses to that, and I will leave a link to sort of like the playlist where you can watch other responses as well. And thanks again to Sammy for starting that tag. It was fabulous. Anyway, a short and sweet favorites video for a short and sweet month of February. Thank you so much for watching. Of course, I have to say a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for all of their support of me and my channel. And especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, Laurie, and Ian Yitzhak for their very generous support of me. And I will talk to you all in the comments below and in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye.